Good morning, everyone. This is Dan Germoni from the Washington Capital Area Chapter of ICEAA. I've got 11:30, but I think I'm anticipating a few more people joining. We're just going to give it 60 more seconds, and then we'll get started with this month's luncheon session. Thanks for joining us today. All right, hello again. This is Dan Germoni, President of the Washington Capital Area Chapter of ICEAA. Thanks everybody for joining us today for our 2022 Luncheon Series. Today we have, the topic is OSD CAPE's AoA Handbook, being presented by OSD's Lieutenant Colonel Dan Summers. Colonel Summers is an Army officer with 10 years of operations research experience. He has a master's degree in operations research from the Air Force Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He'll be talking to us today about the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Cost Assessment Program Evaluations, Analysis of Alternatives, Cost Estimating Handbook, which provides a wider range of resources and inputs relevant to cost analysts completing analysis of alternative presentations. I'll leave it to Dan to describe more, but we're thankful for having everybody here today. Stick around to the end when we'll release a link to a survey, which we'll use to award our end of year Luncheon Presenter of the Year award, and for some other public service announcements from the chapter. With that, Colonel Summers, can you hear me and see your slides? And if so, take it away.
I can. Thanks a lot, Dan. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group. And as I was preparing for this, I talked to my boss, and she reminded me that not everyone might be as familiar with AoAs or do AoAs as much as we have. So I do want to talk just a little bit about the background of AoAs as well. So if you could hit the next slide, please, Dan. So I have 10 years of ORSA experience. I switched over from being a chemical officer to being an ORSA, and my first job as an ORSA was I worked at the TRADOC Analysis Center at Fort Leavenworth, and one of our major responsibilities for the Army at that time was conducting analysis of alternatives for the Army. And so I got the opportunity to work on ground combat vehicle as a war gamer. I was doing simulations for that AoA. I also got to work on the long range precision fires AoA and was doing risk assessments and things like that as part of the long range precision fire. And then lower tier air and missile defense AoA, which was an AoA where we were looking at the replacement or the upgrade to the Patriot missile system, was another one I got to work on as a operational risk analyst. And so I've had quite a bit of the AoA experience at TRAC, but not necessarily from a cost estimate or cost estimator role. Since I've been at CAPE, I've gotten a little bit more of the cost estimator role, and I've been at CAPE for about a year. One of the projects that my predecessor was working on was this AoA handbook that we'll talk a little bit about. And so he passed this off to me. I can't take much credit for the work that was done. I just got it across the finish line and got it published. But Mike Walker, or Lieutenant Colonel Mike Walker, did the lion's share of the work with our coworker Mark Muchler. So they really deserve the credit for getting this handbook together. I have just, published it and done a few presentations about it. But to offer that background of what an AoA is. So an AoA is a requirement as part of the JCIDS, the Joint Capability Integration and Development System process. It generally starts about 40 days prior to the MDD, and it is where we are going to figure out whether the performance, the operational effectiveness, the suitability, the cost, the risk of procuring a new weapon system is worth it, and if it's going to meet the capability gap and the requirements that have been listed. And so when's it required? I've got the blurb there of when it is required. Obviously, it's required early in a defense acquisition process and prior to the formal initiation of the program. And then why does CAPE care? What is CAPE's role? DOTI 5000.84 lists the director of CAPE for those two things, that she is going to develop and issue the study guidance and approve the study plans. So that's a big piece. Before they can even start with an AoA, the director of CAPE is issuing out the study guidance of all of those things that need to be looked at as part of this AoA. And then as the study plan that gets done by the service comes back in, it gets approved by DCAPE. And then finally, we're evaluating the adequacy or the sufficiency of the AoA for all of the major defense acquisition programs. And so, Dan, if you would hit next slide, please. And so what Mike Walker and Mark Mutchler and I have worked on is this handbook to kind of give a best practices and a guide for new estimators or estimators that have not done an AoA cost estimate for a little while. And there's a couple of different reasons why we wanted to bring this together. The majority of it, though, was one, seeing that there were inconsistent levels of effort being done by different groups that were sending AoAs. And so what we wanted to do was to offer up some of the best practices that we saw over time. But then also what we had seen was that some of the guidance, either the manuals or the instructions or other handbooks, had gone either away or had gotten older and had not been updated. And so we wanted to kind of bring together a one-stop location for AoA cost estimates where folks could come and get that guidance and see that. I'm not going to go through, I'll go over the chapters. So it's broken up into 7 chapters and 1 appendix. And obviously you can see that. I'm not going to go into each of the chapters, especially not the chapter that are listed as terminology and as references. But I think those are really valuable for folks that are looking for where all of this information comes from. So if you've not done an AoA cost estimate for a little while, or if you're new to it and you want to come, I think what Mark and Mike did a really good job of was bringing together in the terminology chapter all of the different terms that we might have to use that you might see in an AoA cost estimate. And then in the references, what that does is it gives you a link back to the major places where we found this information if the information is not unique to this handbook. So though I won't go into those chapters, I think that those are really valuable. And then down at the bottom, I've got where we've got this located. So it's on the CAPE external website and under files and then reports, and then you'll see the 2021 AoA cost handbook. And so it's pretty short. It's only 33 pages. And with that, I will start going through some of these chapters to talk about what we've got in it. And so if you could hit next slide, please.
Sorry, bit of latency issue over here, but there we go.
Okay, thanks. So I've talked a little bit about why we did the book. I think one of the things that's valuable in this, and one of the things that we got quite a bit of feedback from while we were looking, sending this back out for comments and things like that. This was meant to be for major defense acquisition programs, and it was meant to be able to be used across services. And so with those two things in mind, what we'll find is that though it could be used for adaptive acquisition framework, pathway things like software, or it could be used for other cost estimates that you see listed below, what it's really meant for is for an MDAP AoA cost estimate. And so you will see that we leave a lot of things out that you might want to see if we were wanting to give guidance on all of the different cost estimates that you might see. We're not looking for that. We're looking really pointedly at AoA cost estimates. And then the second thing being, we're looking at this to be generic enough to be able to be used across services. And so when we got comments back, there were a lot of folks that had really specific things that, our office does it this way, or, our service needs it to say this. And we didn't want to give anything in this handbook that was super service or super program office specific, because we wanted it to be able to be used across services. And so you'll see that as well, that this is meant to be not specific to any one service. And Dan, if you would hit next slide. So the AoA cost guidance, the standard elements of the AoA cost guidance are a life cycle cost estimate for each alternative. It needs to be sufficient quality to support investment and acquisition decisions. It needs to consider how prototyping might affect the development of the production. It needs to ensure that estimates cover the identical period of analysis. So that's a big one that we'll talk about in one of the later best practices. Then it needs to account for the requirements and vulnerability of fuel logistics. So you'll see the appendix, and if we have time, we can go through an example. But looking at the fully burdened cost of fuel, that's a requirement that it has to cover that. And then you'll see that it needs to include the estimates for the APUC, the average procurement unit cost, and for the program acquisition unit cost, the POC. And then one of the big things is using present value and discounting and comparing the alternatives in accordance with our guidelines. And so that's another area where we've seen issues in the past, is that we don't always get inflation and de-escalation done correctly. And so when we're looking for it being of sufficient quality, we're really looking for it to follow that guideline. And so if you could hit the next slide, please, Dan. So life cycle cost estimate. So a cost estimate prepared in support of AoAs are unique in several ways when they're compared to other DoD cost analysis. These unique characteristics are unsurprisingly primarily due to requirements to compare costs across multiple mutually exclusive alternatives covering an identical period of analysis. In the cost book, we have sections that provide discussion for all of the unique characteristics, and we give suggestions for addressing them. So when we talk about the types of costs in a comparative analysis, those are listed below. And so go through each of those costs. So sunk costs per DoD 741.03, a sunk cost is considered a cost that's already been incurred and cannot be recovered, and that is not relevant to prospective investment decisions that are made after the sunk cost has been incurred. So with that, when we're looking at an AoA cost estimate, we should talk about those sunk costs when we're going through the ground rules and making up our assumptions, but we should never include the sunk costs as part of the cost estimate of an alternative or any derivative analysis that's used to distinguish the alternatives from each other. The second one is a common or washout cost. Again, in DOTI 741.03, a common or washout cost is identical in both timing and magnitude for all alternatives. So this is a cost that's not going to add any value by leaving it in. So if the cost is the same for the status quo alternative as well as all of the other alternatives, then leaving that cost in the analysis is only going to mask where the real differences are. So we don't consider washout costs as part of the AoA. But for the purposes of establishing the life cycle cost for each alternative, affordability analysis, and calculation of standard acquisition metrics, the study team must include common costs. So you do it for the affordability analysis and for the APOC. And then this is one that's big for us at CAPE is indirect support costs. So per CAPE's 2020 operating and support cost estimating guide, indirect support costs are those installation and personnel support costs that cannot be identified directly to the units or the personnel that operate and support the system being analyzed. And so what we look to do is to not include these indirect support costs. In addition, a lot of the time, these indirect support costs are probably also washout costs. And so being able to identify them and talk about them is, again, important, but they're not ones that we want to see inside of the analysis of alternative cost estimate. And then one that's a little bit mushy, I think, is the non-financial costs. And so some costs might have intangible social costs, you list negative public perception maybe, or environmental impact associated with the alternative at a societal level. These are really difficult to be able to quantify. And when that's impossible, again, that needs to be discussed with the cost team and across the analysis of alternative team in order to make sure that those non-financial costs are considered elsewhere in the analysis, but when they can't be considered as part of the cost estimate. And then at the bottom, what we look at are some of the special cost considerations by cost category. We see research and development. There's differences in research and development costs across alternatives, which will largely depend on the degree of the technological maturity from one potential solution to another. And so the study team should consider the following areas when working to identify potential cost differences. They should be looking at the scope of developmental tasks. They should be looking at the number and type of prototype units. And they should be looking at the number of vendors and the acquisition strategy for each of those alternatives. The next category is investment. Variation in investment costs between alternatives can arise from differences in required quantities, direct production costs, maturity of the production process, and availability of production capacity. So the study team should consider the following areas when creating investment models and collecting data to estimate the investment costs in an AoA. They should be looking at the learning, so developing a learning curve for the new start alternative. They should be looking at the effects of exchange vehicles and other government-funded equipment on what the production costs. So if one alternative or several alternatives potentially have a lot of government-funded equipment or exchange vehicles that are going to be part of that, we need to be able to consider that as part of the AoA. And then specific support training equipment. So if one alternative has a much different requirement for training. So if one system the service is very familiar with and it's going to require less training or less training equipment, then that's one that we really need to know about. So one from a recent one that we worked on, for example, introducing a 40-ton tracked direct fire vehicle into an infantry brigade combat team will likely require the fielding of new recover capability to the infantry BCT. So we were working on the mobile protected firepower AoA recently. And the different alternatives had different sizes of these vehicles. The different sizes of the vehicle changed what the recoverability was going to be. And so that's certainly going to change what the support equipment is going to look like. If you have one vehicle that's much heavier, it's going to require a different recovery vehicles. It's probably going to require different numbers of organic fuel trucks, different maintainers, different gunnery assets, things like that. And so knowing those differences that exist between one alternative and another are important for being able to figure out the costs associated with the support and the training equipment. MILCON is another of these special areas, and that is that some alternatives may generate different requirements for military construction. Again, looking at the mobile protected firepower, if you've got a heavier vehicle and you have to go back through and do different overhead cranes to be able to do maintenance on these systems, or you have to have different bridges for the weight of these vehicles, then that's certainly MILCON considerations that need to be considered. And then the final special cost category that we've got here are operating and support costs. It's one that's near and dear to Dan Germoni and my heart as we're working on the EVAM-OSC, which is our system that's going to capture a lot of these operating and support costs in a common manner. And so what we see here is that differences in O&S costs across alternatives will typically be tied to the variation in design and operational employment. Design trade-offs between mobility, armament, survivability, and other characteristics can lead to variation in the propulsion system, the suspension, the size, the weight. As a result, underlying system components will have much different reliability, survivability, mobility, things like that. And that will exhibit important variation in the estimated maintenance and sustainment costs for the different alternatives. And so a study team should consider the following areas when preparing their O&S cost estimate for an AoA. And so the first one is the operations manpower requirement. And so what is the differences in the manpower? So when we get the information on the different systems, we need to be able to figure out, is there a different maintenance requirement for one system over another system? Is there a different number of operators? So going back to the mobile protected firepower example, there with two of the alternatives that we had, there was a difference. There was one that had a 4-person crew, and one of those 4 people was a loader for the vehicle. And one of the alternatives that we were looking at one point in time had a automatic loader, an auto loader. And so it only had a 3-person crew. And so that's certainly something that would need to go into the ground rules as the cost team is looking at that, to be able to figure out how they appropriately value the auto loader versus the 4th crew member when they're looking at the O&S costs. You know, one may cost more initially for the auto loader, but the O&S costs might be lower over time by having one less operator on that system. So operation manpower requirement is one that's going to be critical over a life cycle of a vehicle or of a system. Next is organic versus contract maintenance. The AoE team should consult with logistics experts familiar with the commodity group in question to determine whether the service would typically use organic or contractor support level maintenance, and at the different levels of organizational, intermediate, or depot. And so determining what kind of maintenance you're going to use, either organic that's performed by the unit or contract support maintenance, is really critical to being able to know where we're going to capture those costs from. And then the effect of depot maintenance on the operating inventory. And so as you're looking at the life of a system, we have to reflect the costs associated with depot maintenance. So is it going to have repair cycle floats that are available when one of these vehicles or a group of these vehicles have to go in for depot maintenance? What are the types of depot maintenance that the system is going to undergo over its economic useful life? And so having that information is critical at the beginning of an AoA as well. And then we talked about this a little bit, but inflation and escalation, certainly this gets seen to a high degree over a life cycle, economic useful life of a system. Where we see it the most is in military pay, civilian pay, and fuel. And so ensuring that we de-escalate those costs appropriately in accordance with the inflation and escalation best practices for cost analysis guide that our office also put out about a year and a half ago is critical. And then we'll talk more when we get to the appendix for the fully burdened cost of fuel. But AoAs are required to consider the fully burdened cost of fuel as a complement to the standard O&S cost analysis. With that, I've talked for quite a bit of time. I'd like to pause for just a second in case there's any questions up till now before I go into some of the best practices that we've seen from some of the previous AoAs.
Hey, Dan. Dan here. Maybe this is a question you'll get into in a minute, but you mentioned that the guide is really written from an MDAP perspective, but that you had a lot of experience on AoAs. I think it sounded like from a lower than MDAP perspective. Do you know, or what would be your assessment as to the, how similar or dissimilar are the best practices for an MDAP level AoA compared to an AoA that maybe isn't for an entire weapon system platform? Do the commonalities and best practices really carry over, or do bigger and more complex systems require special handling compared to maybe smaller design trade-offs over?
The three I worked on at Track, I think, were MDAPs. They were major system changes, or the GC ground combat vehicle was a replacement for the Bradley. So those were major AoAs. Obviously, they were a number of years ago, so they were a little bit different in what the guidance was at that point in time. But I think that the best practices, the guidance can be used across a lot of different cost estimates. I mean, I think if we thought about the way we do OSRs, operational sustainment reviews for Congress, which have independent cost estimates done by either us or by the services. There's a lot of information that's in this guide that would be useful for that kind of a cost estimate. And then when you look at some of the software, or when you're looking at a rapid prototyping, rapid fielding type pathway, I think there's certainly the guide gives good information that you would use there. It's just, one, it's not necessarily mandatory. We're not necessarily on some of these going to be doing the sufficiency reviews of the lower level. And then I think what you find with some of these, especially like the software pathway, you might have more specific requirements that change a little bit, of where if I were going to have written this guidebook to cover all of those, one, it would be a lot longer, and it would probably contradict itself a little bit when you go between the different pathways and the different levels of analysis.
Sorry for my confusion, but thank you for the answer. Good stuff. Thanks.
Hi, Colonel. This is Jeff. Can you hear me?
I can. Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. And again, maybe we'll get to it later. It has to do with consistency across alternatives and assumptions. And one problem that I always run into with AoAs, and I'm not sure the workaround is, you'll typically have a status quo system that's perhaps already in production or already fielded, and you'll have other alternatives in which they're entering into development. There'll be new technologies, new systems. And when it comes to the O&S cost estimating, you want consistent number of operating years. That status quo system is already out there. And if your life cycle estimate is going to take you out to, say, 30 years from now, how do you account for differences there? That is that existing system, may need to go through an extra depot overhaul, whereas the new systems will just be operating for their regular, 30-year life.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for the question. And we do get to it a little bit more. I'm happy to cover it now. So great question. It's certainly something we run into where you're looking at the status quo and you're looking at going back to the ground combat vehicle, potentially AoA that I worked on. You've got the status quo, which was the Bradley, and it had been around for 20 or 30 years at that point in time. And for it to stay was going to require major upgrades or major overhauls, things like that, in order to give it a common life cycle or lifespan as the different GCV alternatives that were new start rolling off the assembly line. But that's certainly something that we have to do. We have to do one of two things. You can either shorten, and I think the guide gives an example of if you have two systems that have different lifespans. So if you had one system, one new start system that its economic useful life was 20 years and the other one was 30 years, then what you need to do is make a decision as to whether or not you're going to take the 20-year system and do a life cycle expansion on it, schlep the program. That way it can go out to 30 years and associate those costs of doing overhauls or doing upgrades or those different maintenance activities that need to happen to make the 20-year system last for 30 years. Or you stop the analysis or you stop the life cycle of the 30-year at the 20-year point, and then you have to do the costs associated with giving credit for that 10 years of additional life that would be on that second system to that alternative, so that you've looked at the costs only for the 20 years that system A was going to be useful for, but that system B that still has 10 years of useful life is getting a cost credit for that 10 years of additional life that we're not looking at in the analysis. So those are kind of the two ways of looking at that. And obviously that gets a lot more complicated in real life when you've got, data collection for that and all the different pieces of what that would mean. But that's kind of what the guide says. And again, I think we have a section on it in the best practices. Over.
All right, thank you.
And so with that, Dan.
Yeah, hey, Dan,
Sorry.
I left a question in the chat, and this is Steve Stirk from NASA, and I'm currently working on a cost estimate for a deployment, and I'm having a tough time nailing down the fuel costs for an aircraft. It's fluctuating. We get OSD, we get military fuel prices, and then but when we're in a foreign country, it's ranging anywhere between $3 a gallon up to $6 a gallon. So any advice on how to obtain a good cost estimate for fuel costs?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of volatility in fuel prices just inside of the country. So then when you're trying to go outside of the U.S., that's probably going to be a lot more volatile. I think one option would be to use the OSD's published fuel rate, which I can look up and provide for you. The other option would be to go on, and I think you said DLA's website to get the fuel costs associated with it. I think at least from this perspective of an AoA, I think one of the critical pieces is just that you're using that same methodology or that same cost across all of the alternatives. So if you're going with a, more, I think what OSD's published rate would be is probably a more conservative rate. It's probably lower than what DLA's current rate is. And so if you went with that for the starting point and then escalated it with the OSD escalation guide, then that would be an option. And as long as you do it across all of the alternatives, then you're not going to mess that up. I think if you went with the DLA rate, or if you found a rate for the costs in the actual country where the system is going to be deployed, then starting with that same price and using it consistently across alternatives, again, at least isn't going to cause some difference between the alternatives that's only based on the fact that one used a different cost, a different fuel cost. When we get to the chapter on the fully burdened cost of fuel, I think that might make a little bit more difference when you're looking at getting the fuel from the fuel point to the actual system. I'm not sure with a NASA system if that necessarily is the same kind of problem that we run into, or the same cost escalation that we run into with a military system or not. But certainly we can talk more fuel when we get to that chapter. Steve.
Okay, yeah, thank you. It's for our aircraft, one of our NASA science aircraft that we're deploying out of the CONUS. So, like I said, it goes from anywhere from $3. I thought I was good at $4.80 a gallon, and then there was some, the fuel prices are just fluctuating all over the world, and with the DC-8 type aircraft, I'm using tens of thousands of gallons. So.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, Steve, that's a question I think that's a little bit outside of this realm, but I did sit in on a operational sustainment review ICE briefings with the Air Force recently, and they were going over that same issue where they were talking about the cost of fuel obviously can be a driver on some of their systems, and as they were looking at doing these cost estimates for their sustainment reviews and looking at what is the different scenarios, what if the fuel goes back to what it was in 2019 or 2020 or 2021, whenever it started going up quite a bit. What does that look like on their budget? What does it look like if it's if it doesn't go back down and it stays at where it is now? What kind of a gap does that in their budget lines, things like that? So Dan Germoni has my email, or you can see my email here. If you want to shoot me a note, I can work with the folks that we had over on the Air Force side and get some of the, I know they had done a white paper, I believe, on that, or at least gathered some data on what those costs would look like and what impact that would have on them if the fuel either stayed the same or stayed where they expected it to be, or if it stayed as high as it is now and then escalated off of that, what those two differences are. So that might at least give you a high and a low side to be able to compare for similar aircraft type systems.
Hey, okay, thank you, and great lunchtime briefing. Thank you, sir.
Yep, no problem, Steve. Dan, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So yeah, again, this section happened prior to me coming into OSD, but Lieutenant Colonel Mike Walker, Mark Mutchler, my coworker and friend, have collected these best practices up. We'll go over them briefly. We've touched on some of them already, but starting the analysis early, I think that kind of goes without saying, but beginning cost data collection in parallel with development of the list of possible alternatives and getting preliminary cost data collection can help to shape the list of possible alternatives. So when you get that study guidance from OSD, most of the time it's going to have some, very high level costs associated with what a possible alternative can be. And so being able to know at least some idea of what the different systems are going to cost can allow you to eliminate some of those systems that are just super expensive. And so being able to get the cost data early can allow you to get rid of some of the systems from consideration, just based on the fact that they're 2 or 3 times the cost of what the other systems are. And so prioritizing the cost data collection effort will allow the study team to streamline other aspects of the cost analysis to account for differences in the cost data availability across alternatives. And cost data collection for certain alternatives like foreign-made systems may require significant coordination and should be pursued as soon as the study identifies that there is a foreign-made system in consideration, in order to get that data in time to be able to inform the analysis of alternative. The second one also probably goes without saying, but building a robust team. And so it's great to have really expert certified cost analysts on the team, and that's critical to having a good estimate. But it's also important that we have somebody with familiarity about the commodity group in question and representatives from the operating and implementing organizations. So I'm obviously an Army officer, so having people from our centers of excellence, having people from the units, having people from the program office that are part of the team really allows us to be able to understand those different alternatives. Going back to the MPF example, solely as a cost estimator, I might not understand all of the different implications that a difference in weight of a system might have. I might use the difference in weight to be able to go back to an analogous system and compare previous data. But by having somebody from the logistics community and having somebody from the operational community as part of the team, they can talk about all of those other things, that when you get a vehicle that's this heavy, it's going to have these MILCON considerations, or when you have a vehicle this heavy, it's going to have these recoverability issues. And so having those folks on the team is critical to being able to have a quality and a sufficient AoA. Looking at selecting the appropriate cost estimating methodology, and this I would point you to the DoD cost estimating guide, and the cost team should choose the appropriate cost estimating methodology for the available data and for the maturity of the alternative. So when you have a very immature early on system, you're probably going to be, depending on analogous systems, if you get further along, you might be able to use a parametric methodology, then an engineering methodology. And then when you look at those ones where you've got an actual system that's either been fielded or has been tested, then you might be able to use extrapolation from the actual data. And so this methodology should be agreed upon in the AoA ground rules, and it should be agreed upon in such a way that it doesn't give an advantage or a disadvantage to any one of the AoAs. So if you've got some AoA, or sorry, to any one analysis or alternative. So if you've got one alternative that's really mature and one that's not, we have to figure out a way to do the estimating methodology in order to not detriment one of those just because they're not as far along. And that brings up the next one, I think, which is using actual cost data. And so anytime that we're able to do it, we want to be able to get actual data. And so that, is why OSD has the cost assessment data enterprise, CADE, where we're able to capture a lot of the actual costs for weapon systems over time. And then I mentioned it before, the services have their visibility and management of operating and support costs, their VAMOSC databases. And we currently are working on the enterprise VAMOSC system to be able to collect historical O&S costs for analogous systems. But that's the criticality of having access not only to the EVAMOSC and to CADE for that data, but being able to find those actual data sources and tying your analysis to actual data is of critical importance. We want folks to use the common work breakdown structure, WBS, for all alternatives, and using MIL standard 881 and the appropriate index to identify all appropriate work breakdown structure for the commodity group. This common structure will assist with comparison. So again, we want the comparison to be consistent across the alternatives. So being able to bin that data by the appropriate WBS allows us to quickly and clearly be able to compare alternatives over time. And then assessing interaction of cost and schedule. So we want to align the cost estimate for each alternative with a schedule consistent with historic experience for the technical complexity of the alternative, or use historical schedule data from programs with similar technical characteristics to assess the risk inherent to the proposed acquisition timeline for each alternative. And so with that, what we're looking at is being able to understand where risks are, what risks we're taking with a schedule. If we've got one alternative that that's either not very mature or has a lot of technological advancements that the other ones might not have, or technological complexity that's required for that, then being able to look at historic systems or actual data to be able to figure out what the schedule for those different alternatives would look like is critical. Obviously, conducting sensitivity analysis and highlight inflection points. So we want you to be able to look at the differences in the life cycle cost and the metrics from different alternatives and conduct sensitivity analysis, and then communicate those results across the entire AoA team. And especially in those areas that are cost drivers or are going to lead to large differences when a small piece changes. So if there's something that could change a percentage of the cost or things like that a small amount of change in that would cause a big variance in the overall information or significant impact on the AoA, then we need to be able to do that sensitivity analysis and highlight that. We want to be able to provide time phase results, so provide annual costs in both constant year and then year at the major appropriation level for the base case and for each alternative. This time phase data is critical for assessing affordability risks when the weapon system's lifetime and for identifying the effects of the programmatic decisions over time. And then we want to present all of our results in the appropriate dollar type. So, I mean, that goes back to our inflation. It goes back to the fact that we should provide required and recommended cost estimate output in then year and the desired constant year dollars. We see then year dollars as being useful for comparing the effects of different alternatives on the DoD budget, whereas constant year is useful for comparison of the total program costs and for affordability metrics such as the total life cycle cost, the POC, the APUC, the AUMC, and for other key performance parameters. And then identifying cost contributors within the cost alternatives to assist with trade-off discussions involving cost and capability. So again, we want to be able to illuminate the available trade space for decision makers. I think I use the MPF example of the difference in one having an auto loader, one having a extra crew member. And so that's certainly a trade-off, a trade space aspect that you would want to highlight the differences in those costs to your decision makers. Making leadership aware of these cost issues during the AoA can enable proactive refinement of requirements to ensure an achievable, affordable acquisition program. And then we want to follow DoD cost guidance, cost policy and guidance for preparing the DoD cost estimates. I think, again, that probably should go without saying, but organizations conducting AoA cost analysis are not the same organizations that are responsible for preparing cost estimates in support of other defense acquisition processes. And so as a result, cost estimators in these organizations may not be as familiar with DoD cost policy, guidance, and best practices. So that's, again, why we want this guide to be out there. It's why we want this guide to tie back to a lot of the DoD cost policy so that someone can come to this and be able to get pointed out to the right policy and guidance so that they are tied in the same way that folks that are doing the other aspects of the defense acquisition process are. And then engaging early and providing regular updates to either the service headquarters and also to us here at OSD. So if we're able to understand the differences between the alternatives, if we're able to understand any discrepancies and provide updates during regular in-progress reviews, we can make sure that there's not going to be a sufficiency issue at the end. And so I think that's, obviously a critical piece, is that have those conversations back with the service and back with OSD as early as you possibly can. It's only going to make things easier in the end. And then documenting the life cycle cost estimate for each alternative. So as with any cost estimate, the cost analysis in support of an AoA should be conducted and documented so that a trained cost analyst could produce the exact same result given the final cost report and the identical data. So we want this to be reproducible, and any files that you're making should allow that to happen. At a minimum, the cost analysis team should document and archive all ground rules, all assumptions, and all data sources, files, and source system points of contact. That way we can reproduce that if necessary. And then we'd really like to see the cost estimator that's doing the estimate be the one that's writing the cost section or the appendix in the final AoA report. So it's a lot of times, like I said, the AoA team is a much larger group, and it's easy for the estimate to go to that group and for an analyst at, when I was at TRAC, for instance, for the cost estimate to come back to TRAC, and for an analyst at TRAC to write the cost chapter or cost section or the appendix, which was good in the aspect that it followed the same flow as the rest of the AoA, but it's bad in the fact that the person that's the expert on it, the cost estimator, isn't the one that's writing that. So to ensure that the final AoA report accurately reflects any major cost conclusions and correctly represents all of the underlying analysis, the cost team should serve as the primary author for the cost section and appendix. And so that takes us through the best practices. I know I'm getting a little close on time, Dan, so I'm going to buzz through affordability analysis quickly. So this, again, is from DoD 5084, and AoAs must consider the affordability of proposed solutions to include milestone decision authority established affordability goals. And so when we look at this, what we're looking at is for the affordability analysis construct, we want to look at the future budget. We want to look at the future total budget projection for each DoD component for affordability analysis. We want to look at the time horizon. In an AoA, affordability analysis should cover the study's entire period of analysis. Affordability analysis should extend for enough years to reveal the life cycle costs and inventory implications of the alternatives under consideration. It should also include fiscal guidance, absent any specific guidance from the director of CAPE or the service acquisition executive for the program in question. Each component can select or may project its top line budget. And then inflators, the affordability analysis assumes constant purchasing power, and portfolios, components should subdivide their accounts into the defined portfolios to facilitate trade-off analysis. And then the component should, affordability analysis should be consistent with any relevant existing portfolio plans and strategies, such as the required statute for 30-year plans required by 10 U.S. Code 231 for ships and 10 U.S. Code 231A for aircraft. And so those are kind of the inputs for affordability analysis. And then if you go to the next slide, Dan, it shows an output, or at least an example output for affordability analysis. And so this example only covers a single appropriation and in one phase of the system's life. In order to be deemed sufficient, the AoA's affordability analysis should consider all phases and all relevant appropriations. This is just an example, so it's only showing one. CAPE recommends providing 3 separate charts when presenting and documenting affordability analysis in the AoA. It should have the RDT&E portfolio, the procurement portfolio, and the O&S multiple appropriations portfolio, all as their own chart. So 3 different charts, but what this notional portfolio in the example shows is that the procurement cost estimate for 3 alternatives under consideration present an affordability challenge in fiscal years 2027 through 2031. If you note, the estimate for each alternative is displayed separately on the chart instead of using only an average or representative cost estimate. So that's the way it should be. This type of result might lead the components decision makers to carefully consider the return on investment of any additional capabilities offered by alternatives 1 and 3 versus alternative 2. All of the alternatives would require resource adjustments within the portfolio. So you can see that they're all above the line. So they're all going to require some adjustments in order to be affordable in this ground vehicle procurement area to address the forecasted resource shortages. However, the adjustments required for alternative 2 are smaller in magnitude on this chart. So that's where this is meant to give information to the decision makers as they're looking at the affordability over time. They can see where those challenges are going to present themselves and which of the alternatives might have the biggest ones. The next chapter is one I'm going to skip, which was references. And then, Dan, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to hit really, really quickly on the fully burdened cost of fuel. So again, this is a requirement for us to do the fully burdened cost of fuel. And if you go one more slide, Dan, I think it's got my example. Yeah, so this chart kind of shows the way that the fully burdened cost of fuel delivery process. So you've got the fuel delivered to a port or terminal by DLA. The port or terminal is the yellow box. It's the retail point of sale. Then you've got the tactical delivery, which is the military supply chain, including force protection. Then the hexagon is the battle space delivery, which is the combat offload and refueling. And then you finally, down in the little gray arrow at the bottom, you've got the system fuel demand. And then that brings us to the fully burdened cost of fuel. And so what we're looking at is getting all of those costs from the point of delivery. So not just the amount of dollars that the fuel costs, but what does it cost to have those delivered by a tactical delivery asset. We would potentially need to do scenarios to find out in a combat situation how many of those delivery assets are going to be destroyed, how much fuel is going to be lost, what's the operating and sustainment costs associated with those vehicles that are having to deliver the fuel. You have to depreciate the cost of the fuel delivery assets to include if you lose them in combat. You have to detriment the cost of the fuel vehicles that are lost in combat. You have to consider the security assets that have to be there to make sure that the fuel can get delivered safely. So all of the O&S costs, the direct fuel costs, the depreciation costs of all of your security vehicles to get those from the port or terminal to the actual point of use on the battlefield. And and so we have to add all of that in. The manual has a pretty good, Handbook has a pretty good calculation for how you calculate that fully burdened cost of fuel, given all of those different aspects. And so I don't think I quite have time to go into that, but that is the last chapter. And then if you can hit next slide, Dan? Or sorry, that's Appendix A. Yep, those are the elements that I just kind of described, and that's the calculation in the handbook. And then one more slide, please, Dan. So for those of you that are actually doing cost estimates and AoAs, what I would really like is for folks to go in and use this handbook and tell me where it is good, where it's bad, where you need more information, things like that. The reason we did it as a handbook was not just because it's a little bit easier to get published, but because we wanted it to be a living document that we could make changes to. I fully expect that there will be additional appendices that will come. I know there's interest in doing, like the social cost of carbon that may come as a requirement as part of AoAs at some point in time. And so when that happens, we will add the appendices to give that guidance as well. But we do mean for this to be flexible enough that if folks go in there and there's stuff that's either missing or that's changed or that isn't as helpful as you would like, I would love to hear about, what those are so that we can make this better for the people that are using it, especially from that mindset of somebody that's, either newer to doing these cost estimates or that don't do them super regularly. So needing that refresher. So would really appreciate anybody that's using it or that's doing these to use it and give me feedback. And with that, I know I'm over, so I'll happy to answer any questions, or obviously Dan can provide anybody with my email, and I'm happy to answer those offline as well. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Colonel. I think we did have a question or a hand raised.
Yes, this is Chris Massey from Technomics. I had a quick question on you mentioned affordability as part of these AoAs. How about executability? Is there any discussion about executability? So on the other side of actually being able to execute the funding if we're able to get it. Is there any guidance on that in the AoA process that you go through?
Thanks, Chris. So you're saying the executability versus the affordability. I think those are kind of tied hand in hand. I think that's where you would, if you're looking at executability of the funds to do this system. I mean, that's what the Milestone Decision Authority is making that decision based on this. So we've been able to show them what the system is going to cost from the estimate, what it's going to cost over its life cycle. We can show them in the affordability analysis where that falls with their top line. And so I think that gives them the ability to make the decision as to is this procurement executable? So I think that would be my answer on that. If you're looking at it from is this AoA executable in these timelines, that kind of falls outside of the cost and on the other portions of the AoA team that's going to be doing technological risk and those types of analysis outside of the cost realm. Over.
Okay. Yeah. No. Yeah. That provides some clarification. Most of the time, and it could be depending on the commodity that you're looking at, but sometimes we're asked actually when in the final AoA meetings where we have alternatives set up, can I even go buy this? And especially now with supply chain issues of like if you're ever leveraging industry as part of your AoA alternatives, it's like even if I had the money, would I be able to go procure this as part of the analysis of alternatives? It's kind of, I've seen that recently feeding into the AoA saying like, even if I choose this route, can I actually go buy it, even if I had an infinite amount of money? So those are the things that I think we've seen in other organizations.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you do hear those discussions. I don't think that I've heard those discussions as part of the cost estimates, but I don't know where that would actually go in. I mean, maybe into some of the schedule. And then I know we have discussions as to changes in quantity based on the contracts and things like that. Does the contract allow us to up or lower the number of systems that we're going to procure in a given year based on the budget and things like that. So making sure that you've got a flexible contract that can allow for those changes is probably a little bit to what you're talking about of executability, but that's kind of outside of the cost realm. That's just an input to our cost is those contracts. Over.
Okay. Yep. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Colonel Summers. Obviously, lots to talk about with respects to AoAs. Great to get an overview from the guidebook from you today. I've dropped in the link for today's Luncheon survey. If folks don't mind going ahead and taking that, it helps us make sure that we're bringing you all the type of content you're interested in, and that gives us an opportunity to, hand out an award at the end of the year for our Luncheon Speaker Presentation of Excellence. I've also dropped Colonel Summers' email along with my own and the chapter's email address in the survey, along with some links to some of the references Colonel Summers mentioned today.